Salvete amici, and welcome to another episode of the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. I am Kostas, back with you again, and I'm alongside Andrew. Hello, Andrew.
Hey, Kostas. It's great to be here as always, and I am particularly excited because today we're going to be talking about some of our grammar pet peeves.
Yeah, this is going to be a little different kind of show. So we spent a lot of time talking about conversational Latin and talking about Latin proper, but today we're going to talk about Latin and English interrelating in terms of grammar and some of the things that people have trouble with simply because they don't know Latin. And most people don't know Latin, I should say. I think you have a bold assertion to begin our program today, Andrew. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but I have a lot of bold assertions, so I can probably come up with one.
I figured you could just pick one at random, yes.
Okay, yeah, I'll pick one. So my bold assertion is that if you want to be able to use English well, if you want to be able to use it effectively, whether you're speaking it or you're writing it, there's one good way to get there, and that's to learn Latin. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the way to do it. And everybody who has learned Latin knows this. This is the big secret of people who know Latin, that if you want to be good with English, you got to be good with Latin. I mean, maybe you disagree with me, Kostas, but
I would never disagree with that.
Oh,
no,
good.
Not with that. No, absolutely not. I think that's a foundational tenet, as a matter of fact. I think, we've spoken to a lot of people, and I'm sure all of you listening out there know exactly what we're talking about when we say that students generally come from a background these days where they don't know English grammar nearly as well as they once did. And that definitely affects the way that they learn Latin. And it really is kind of a vice versa situation, because the more Latin grammar you know, the more you learn about English. And it's interesting because this actually happened to me last week. I was observing a class, and one of the students said, "There are so many things about English that I never knew until I took Latin because I was forced to learn them."
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no question that most of the Latin students I have had in my life have had a pretty vague understanding of English grammar, and they've generally spoken English in the way people speak English, making the same grammatical mistakes that people around them make. I mean, and that's a normal thing to do. But after taking Latin with me, they absolutely knew the difference between who and whom. I would say 95% of them, before they took Latin with me, had no idea what the difference was. Probably thought, well, they were just interchangeable. You just use who or whom whenever you felt like it. But they definitely knew after they'd taken Latin what the difference between those two words was. And, I'm not saying that if people say who all the time, that it's the end of the world or it's a bad thing. But if you really do want to understand the rules of English, and I think a lot of people do, a lot of people would like to know English better, well then, learn Latin. That's it. That's the way to get there.
Yeah. Today's show was actually inspired by a sign in a grocery store, but more on that in a few minutes. But before we get there, Andrew, what do you suppose is another reason that people have difficulty with English and in turn have difficulty with Latin? So there's something missing.
Well, something's missing. Well,
that's a loaded comment, I realize.
I mean, there are a lot of things missing, I guess. I think in the end, it's just that most people's understanding of English is intuitive. So they hear people talking English, and then they intuitively learn to speak the same way. They don't think about it. They don't know what the rules are. They just say it. And if everybody is speaking English in the same way, well, if there are times when the accepted rules of English grammar differ from that, the only way you're going to know is to learn those rules, to learn that grammar. And it's fine to have lessons in English grammar. I don't think that's a bad thing. The problem with that is, I mean, I can remember my entire 8th grade year, I think, was taken up with English grammar. We were constantly diagramming sentences. I remember this. But
I didn't get the pleasure of diagramming sentences, and all I ever heard from my mom, who went to Catholic school, were nuns diagram sentences until they were blue in the face on the chalkboard and force people to come up and do it. Was you had to know how to diagram a sentence. I had no idea. I mean, I just didn't know what it was or how to do it.
Well, that's Catholic education, definitely sentence diagramming. I can tell you that from personal experience. But that certainly helped a little bit, but it was only when I had to compare English to another language. When I had to compare it to Latin, that's when things really clicked. That's when I really started to understand these rules of English grammar that nobody really even talks about. One of those, I don't think, I mean, I think I have a pretty good idea of English grammar now, but I think it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I understood the difference between shall and will. I mean, that's an example of one that, most people don't understand these days. I mean, maybe they didn't in previous times, although I have a feeling they did. I think that's an example of one of those things that's falling out of the language. But, even after all those years of schooling, I didn't really understand that. But Latin helped me to get there. But anyway, we've got a list of grammar mistakes here.
Yeah.
We got written down here a list of grammar mistakes people make. And we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about why, if you take Latin, you're not going to make those mistakes anymore. But
right.
as you said,
there's actually another point to be made in there. How much of a factor do you think the fact that English is largely no longer an inflectional language and Latin is an inflectional language, how much of a role do you think that plays in all of this?
well, I'm looking at this list, and that is behind the majority of mistakes that we have on the list here.
Mm-hmm.
No question. So English still does have the remnant of a case system for some words. Not very many, but for some. And because it's such a small number of words, that means that English speakers really aren't used to the concept of a case system.
Right.
And I think for that reason, a lot of mistakes are made with that. But of course, if you did understand, what role each word had in the sentence, and you took Latin and you knew about the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, then that probably wouldn't be an issue.
Right. It's always interesting for me when I'm first introducing Latin to a student, and there have been many times this has occurred for me. And first of all, you tell them that Latin is an inflectional language, and they don't really know what an inflectional language is until you explain it to them. And then you really blow their minds by telling them that English used to be one, but it's not so much anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it depends what you even mean by English, right?
Well, yeah.
But things change. Languages change. And there's no question that English is changing. But, that doesn't mean that we have to be ignorant of the rules of the language. Now, maybe next year they'll decide, well, we've had enough of this whole whom thing. We're getting rid of it forever. And nobody will say whom ever again. But, some people like to continue to use that remnant of a case system. And if they want to do it, if they want to know what the rules are, how English works, then it's important that it be broken down in an effective way. But anyway, let me talk about that. You're talking about an experience I had at the grocery store.
Yeah, I gave a bit of foreshadowing on that. But yes, please tell the audience where this is coming from.
So anyway, the germ of this episode of the podcast actually came to me today. So this gives you an idea of how far we plan ahead on these things. Anyway, but let me go back a couple weeks. A couple weeks ago, they put up this sign at the checkout counter of the grocery store I go to. And the sign says, anyone who wants a turkey for Thanksgiving should order their turkey by October 15th. And the word there was spelled T-H-E-R-E. Now, every time I go through that checkout, I want to say something, but I don't say anything.
Because you're such a nice guy?
No, it's not because I'm a nice guy. It's because I know if I bring it up, it'll be as if I were speaking Chinese. They would have no idea what I'm talking about. It would be a pointless conversation. Well, anyway, today I was there and somebody had actually crossed out the there and written in T-H-E-I-R.
Now, did they actually cross it out? You could tell it was crossed out?
Oh, yeah, it was crossed out. Somebody had written in with a pen.
Okay.
I don't think it was a vandal. I think it was probably somebody who works at the grocery store. But clearly somebody else had brought it up. But then I thought, well, okay, that's great. But this sentence, anyone who wants a turkey for Thanksgiving should order their turkey by October 15th. Technically, it should be his turkey or her turkey. But I, again, did not bring that up. Anyhow, this is, the way English is used. So people don't know the difference between there, and there. They don't know the difference between your and your, Y-O-U-R, Y-O-U apostrophe R-E. Mm-hmm. They don't know the difference because, as I said, they don't have that sort of rule-based knowledge of the language. They have an intuitive knowledge of the language, and it's based on sounds more than on writing. And so it's very easy for people to make those sorts of mistakes. So to not understand the difference between T-H-E-I-R and T-H-E-R-E. But that's just one example. We got a whole list here.
And of course, if they didn't want to get tangled up with all that, they could have simply said, should order it by October 15th.
Yeah, but the thing is, people who make mistakes like this don't actually realize that there's an issue.
That is true. There's a bit of a lack of self-awareness on their part.
Right. But I guess somebody brought it up, and now they maybe have a slightly better idea. But who knows? I mean,
let's hope they've learned their lesson well.
I've been a teacher for a while, and I know you often have to repeat things many times. Or even better, you need to make the student repeat it many times before the student, really understands it. But Kostas, what's another example?
Okay, so who and whom, or taken to similar extremes, whoever and whomever.
Right. Yeah, this is a biggie. In fact, I would say that this is the biggest mistake that people make. And most people you run into speak English never use whom. It's just who 100% of the time.
Yeah. Well, that used to be the case, I would find, but I have now found that people have started to use whom, but unfortunately, they're doing so in a manner which is incorrect. So they're overcompensating, or they're overcorrecting themselves when they use it. So rather than use it as an objective something in the objective case as part of the clause that it is contained within, they're using it in a subjective way. So to go back to the example from that sign in the store, I hear people now who would say, anyone whom wants a turkey. Because
Right.
they think that I should be using whom. I guess it belongs here. No.
Right. Well, they're like Jude the Obscure. They they want to be educated. They want to sound smart, but they just don't have the knowledge that would allow them to do it correctly. They're just sort of doing whatever and hoping that it works, but obviously they're not really following the rules of the language. And I think that it's an even bigger issue with whoever versus whomever, because people who use whoever and whomever, they will oftentimes, those people will understand the difference between who and whom, but they'll trick themselves in this case, because they won't understand that whoever or whomever, the one you choose is based on its role in its own clause, right, not in the main clause. And they'll often make it whomever when it should be whoever, because it seems just like an extension of the main clause. Well, that's where the direct object should be, so I'll make it whomever.
And of course, this shows up big time when you're teaching students relative clauses in Latin, and they're having to go from English to Latin, and you see this. It plays out almost exactly this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I know when I'm teaching them, I don't put up with it. I mean, they eventually figure it out, but it's only because you've got this context of looking at English as compared to Latin, as compared to this other language. It somehow makes it much easier then to understand the rules of English grammar. Now, another one that's related to this is not just the difference between who and whom, but the difference between the four relative pronouns, who, whom, which, and that. This is where there are even more mistakes, I think. And in fact, you'll find that a lot of people these days just use that for all four of those. They'll just say that all the time.
Yeah, that's a matter of oversimplification, I think. People wanting to use as few words as possible. And, we see this now even with emojis. People can't be bothered to type out words, so they go for the emoji.
Yeah, well, maybe we're going back to hieroglyphs.
Maybe we are.
Maybe that's eventually, alphabets are going to be out, and we will return to a pictorial written language. I mean, it's not unlikely. I mean, because, people who really understand philology, who have studied a lot of languages, understand that there are these very long cycles that exist. And so, what are things going to look like in 1,000 years? Well, it's entirely possible, in fact, I would say not improbable, that English will no longer exist at that point. Yeah. Maybe there will be something that came out of English, or maybe English will just die and be replaced by something else, or maybe there won't be humans around, it'll just be animals. And so, we won't be speaking English, it'll just be rats speaking rat language. I don't know. But anyway, who, whom, which, and that. I mean, obviously the difference between who and whom, people who know Latin understand, and this is how I always put it to students. It's amazing how complicated it is when you try to explain the difference between who and whom using English grammar terminology. But if you just explain to students who is the nominative, whom is every other case,
Right.
it's so simple. It's a whole lot easier for them to grasp. And when they're using English, it's very easy for them to think, oh, that's accusative, has to be whom. That's nominative, has to be who. Now, the difference between who and whom and which and that, this is, I think it's easier for students to understand this because of Latin as well, because Latin students understand gender. So they know there's masculine, feminine, and neuter. Now, it doesn't work perfectly. So if you're, it doesn't match that, but they do understand, okay, there are people versus things. And so if it's people, it's going to be who or whom. If it's things, it's going to be which or that. And then I also think that explaining the difference between which and that, and this is a little bit more complicated because the rules are not consistent all around the English-speaking world for this. But at least in America, if you read most English grammars that come out of America, they say you use which when the antecedent is a thing and the relative clause is surrounded by commas and is an aside. You don't need it. It's not a necessary extension of the meaning of the main part of the sentence. And you use that when there are no commas and it is an extension of the main part of the sentence. And the thing is, students who take Latin have a much better understanding of that because, they have to. They definitely need to understand there's a reason why there are commas around this relative clause, and there's a reason why there are not commas around this relative clause. That's something that comes up, and you can't avoid it. And so students end up understanding that difference.
Mm-hmm.
But
we've got another big one here, and this is one you and I were talking about before the show. Using I, personal pronoun I, and me, and when to differentiate them according to whether it's a subjective or objective use. And this is one that really kind of burns my biscuits a little bit. Well, a lot of things burn my biscuits, I guess. But
yeah, you get burned a lot.
For example, of course, people will say a lot, and who among us has not said, "It's me," when you pick up the phone or something. And of course, it's not proper to say that.
I don't say that.
You don't say, "Oh, well, you're just above us all then, aren't you?"
I refuse to say that. Oh, yes, I am. Definitely.
Pray tell, what do you say when you answer the phone?
I say, "It is I." Because this is what I was taught when I was a small child. If I didn't say it that way, the nuns would beat me.
Yeah, well, no, we're making fun a little bit, but that you're absolutely right, and those ruler wielding nuns were correct as well. So absolutely, you're supposed to say it is I because it's subjective. It's a predicate nominative, of course. But the fact of the matter is that most people don't do that. But I think over the last maybe a decade and a half, 2 decades even, again, there's a sort of overcompensation of things, which is what we were talking about with who and whom. And now you have people using I when they shouldn't be using it. They're using I objectively when they should only be using it subjectively. So, for example, if we say, this is the 13th episode of the podcast for Andrew and I, you'll hear people saying that now. And of course, that's totally wrong. You should be saying it's the 13th episode for Andrew and me because it's an objective use. It's an object of a preposition.
Well, I think there's at any point in time, there are rules of grammar that a society focuses on because they're seen as as a way to tell the difference between people who are of a higher class and people who are of a lower class. Mm-hmm. And I think the I, me, and then, other pronouns, subject, object pronouns, that's really what people are looking at in this period in order to make that distinction. And in the end, throughout time, this is something that most people care about a lot. So is this person higher class or is this person lower class? And they use language to figure that out. Now, they no longer use who or whom to do that, it seems. So they just assume everybody's going to say who, or maybe they'll just say that all the time, and it seems to be acceptable. Yeah. But it's not acceptable to get I and me wrong. No. And for that reason, people who don't actually understand the rules will try to get it right because they understand that they'll look bad if they get this wrong. But then, of course, they get it even more wrong.
Exactly. And it makes my ears cringe because you'll hear people say, well, he told Joe and I where he was going.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a common one. No question. You hear that quite a lot. And that sort of person is trying. He's not doing this effectively, but he's trying to sound higher class, I think, in that situation. Now, I would say if you want to sound high class, well, you better actually learn the rules, or you're just going to be flailing around and not really getting anywhere, and you're not going to be achieving what you want to achieve. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously not just I and me. It's also he versus him, she versus her.
Right.
Same exact deal. So people do not understand the difference between a subject and an object. Yeah. And yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, let's take a quick time out, and when we come back, we'll give a few more examples like this and talk about some other things that Latin and English have in common and that are an issue for people who don't know Latin and would not be if they did. So more fun, rollicking stories right after this.
Thanks so much for listening to the Gray Fox Latin Teachers podcast. I'd like to talk for a minute about why you should refer your students to Gray Fox Tutors. First of all, flexibility. Our tutors and teachers are located in multiple time zones, and all tutoring is done online. So there will always be a tutor available at the time you need. Number two, reliability. Gray Fox and Carmenta Tutors have been in operation since 2008, employing dozens of tutors and teachers. We will not suddenly cancel tutoring sessions because our own midterms are coming. And three, we're the best of the best. Carmenta Online only hires the best teachers and tutors, and only the best and most experienced of these are promoted to the Gray Fox division.
Okay, we're back. And before the break, we were giving a few examples, some common English faux pas, let's say, that largely originate from the fact that the English case system is currently lacking, and that it causes issues for people who don't know another inflectional language like Latin. And we were just talking about I versus me, and he versus him, and she versus her. But there's another thing I think that is a big issue, at least for me. Once again, this is one of my pet peeves, and that would be the lack or the loss, I would even say, of the subjunctive mood in English now.
Yeah, nobody knows what to do with that. Nobody has any idea. I mean, maybe 1 in 1,000 people has half a clue.
I think that's being generous.
Yeah. I mean, even those people won't have a complete knowledge of the subjunctive in English. And I can understand why. It's because it's all over the place. So in order to understand the subjunctive in English, you have to have learned about 50, maybe it's more than 15 to 20 different distinct examples. And the context is different for each one. And you need to know, well, if there's a sentence like this has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot to remember. And in fact, most people never really learn it. Now there was a time when people just knew it because they heard it all the time. These rules that we have about the subjunctive only exist because there was a time when most people, in fact, would follow those rules. They didn't know why they were doing it, but they just knew. So these days, and I think there's a combination of things. So you will hear people often using the subjunctive correctly, but then you will often hear people not using it correctly. Yeah. And when there's a situation like that where people are hearing two different things, they will tend to fall back on the grammar that they do know. Mm-hmm. And the grammar that they do know doesn't include the subjunctive. They know the indicative. And so they'll have this tendency to assume that it's the indicative that is the correct way because that's what they learned in school. If they learned any of this in school, they learned that. So, obviously there is that famous line from that musical Fiddler on the Roof. And Tevye says, "If I were a rich man." But I would bet most people nowadays would say, "If I was a rich man."
Yeah.
And when you hear that over and over, you don't know what to do. Okay, I've heard it this way, but then I've heard it this way. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to fall back on "if I was a rich man" because, that's how I always learned it. I was. And this "I were" just sounds like bad English. It just sounds like English people use who don't know how to speak English, right?
Yeah. And then if you're fortunate enough to find someone who does know to use the subjunctive, then they come along and say something like, "If it were me."
Right.
Which it's total, again, botch of the I versus me, which we talked about in the previous
segment. Yeah, there are a lot of different rules that go into a sentence, even into a clause.
Complicated stuff.
Right. So, yes, I was fortunate to have parents who taught me about the predicate nominative when I was young.
You can't put a price on that kind of love.
Well, whatever you want to call it. They certainly repeated it enough times so that I knew that was incorrect. I knew that it had to be "if it were I." But even my parents, I don't think, had a terribly good grasp of the subjunctive. The subjunctive is really, there are possibly, I don't know, I would say you might find 1,000 people in this country who have a clear idea of it. And I'm going to tell you, I will bet that the majority of them have been classic students.
Yeah.
I would bet.
I think that's a safe bet.
Yeah. But anyway, an example. Yeah. So when I was taking Latin in college, we learned these sentences that would help us remember how to translate certain Latin sentences. So if a sentence was a contrafactual in the present, we learned the sentence, "If I were king, you would be my prime minister." And if it were contrafactual in the past, we learn the sample sentence. If I had been king, you would have been my prime minister. Well, because I learned those two sentences, I never make mistakes, at least in that small part of the subjunctive in English. I know how to do those sentences without a problem. Now, that's relatively simple compared to, some other subjunctive uses. But it was Latin that allows me to do that correctly. No question.
And this whole thing with the subjunctive too is made even more confusing by the fact that it's not grammatically incorrect to say, for example, if I was at home. It's just a different condition that you're talking about. So if you're saying if I were at home versus if I was at home, well, both are grammatically correct, but in their own way.
Yeah, that's getting a little bit too complicated, I think.
I might have just plunged headlong into the abyss with that. I don't know. Maybe a little too much.
Now we're talking about super advanced English grammar knowledge there.
These are the types of things that go through my brain. And actually, the sentence that I just uttered made me think of another thing. So there's this misplaced attraction to the plural, right? So what am I talking about in particular? When people say kind of or types of or sort of or things like this. So they'll say that kind or they'll say those kind of people, for example. You know what I mean? Those kind of people.
Right.
Obviously, they're pulling the attraction from people, which is plural, over to those when actually those is that word is supposed to modify kind, which is singular. So that kind, that type, that sort. That's another thing that bothers me quite a bit.
Well, again, it's because people don't actually know the rules of grammar.
And you couldn't do that in Latin, right? You couldn't.
Well, I mean
you could, but
I might dispute that.
Yeah.
maybe not that exact thing, but I mean, I would say that, in fact, not the exact same thing, but somewhat similar things have happened in the Latin language as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's with relative pronouns. So there's some writers who actually, the relative pronoun, the case of it won't be the right case according to the rules that we've learned that say the case of the relative pronoun has to come from its use in the relative clause, but they'll be attracted. I mean, this is the terminology I've used. They'll be attracted into the main clause, and then the case will actually be the case that would make sense for that word in the main clause. Now, this is only when there's no visible antecedent. This can happen. And this is something that actually happens in English as well. So we mentioned whoever versus whomever. I've noticed that people who do have some sort of idea of the difference between who versus whom will often use whomever. And I've actually heard this a lot, on TV shows and movies, on the radio. I've heard this mistake quite a lot. And these are people who probably consider themselves to be really highly intelligent. I'm smart. I'm saying
as
whomever.
Most people do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are definitely some people who want to seem that way. And if they throw that M in, then they really feel very superior. But they will make the mistake of thinking that it's whomever because that would make sense for the main clause. But of course, it's its role in the relative clause that matters. And that should tell you whether it's who or whom. I mean, especially if it's the object of a preposition. If that relative clause ends up being the object of a preposition, they make that mistake a lot. So I will trust in whomever I like. I hear that all the time. And I understand why the mistake is made. Because there's a certain amount of grammar knowledge there, but they haven't gone that extra step to understand that it doesn't matter. I mean, the object of the preposition is actually the entire clause. It's not that one word. It's not the relative pronoun. But anyway, I mean, I'm a little bit worried now that we might be losing the audience. So we're getting maybe a little bit too much into the details here, but
perhaps I got a bit esoteric. I apologize.
Well, anyway, I was rambling, but long story short, there are a lot of mistakes people make, and they don't have to. Those mistakes don't have to be made. I mean, if you actually understand the rules, then you will do these things correctly in English. And as I said earlier, I've really found that it's a lot easier to remember all this stuff if it's compared to Latin.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, you hear a lot of students say, I never really understood English grammar until I took Latin. And that's not an accident. I mean, partially maybe it says a lot about education in America. So maybe it says that schools really aren't focusing on English grammar, but I think it's more than that. I think that it's difficult to understand something really well if you've always had it. So if you've been speaking English from when you were very young, it's hard to understand the details. You're just too close to it. But Latin acts as a sort of mirror onto English. And because you have that there, it allows you to see English a lot better.
Yeah. And just one other point here, something else that we were talking about before the show is the way that language is constantly changing. And, of course, that doesn't help matters, and we've alluded to that in a number of places here today by what we've been saying. And I think that this is reflected in nowhere better than in the dictionary. And we were going through all these words that have been added to the dictionary now that they just announced a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, you had a little tirade before the show.
I was pretty heated about this. Yeah, because some of these words are quite annoying to me, especially the portmanteaus like hangry and what was the other one that was really bugging me? I forget.
Right. Well, just to explain, we're talking about words that have recently been added to the Webster's dictionary. Or in fact, this past year, they've been added to the Webster's dictionary. And I'm right now looking at a web page that has a list of some of these. And some of them I have heard, so I'm not shocked that they're including these. And in fact, some of them are old. So they've got ribby as a way to say RBI in baseball, runs batted in. And, I was 5 years old and I remember hearing that. So that's clearly
I'm not sure what took so long for that one to get in.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't understand any of this. I mean, I don't know what the process is. I mean, is there a committee? How do they decide this? Because it seems a little bit arbitrary, all of this here. I mean, but I find dictionaries to be strange things because, they usually claim to contain all the words in a language, but that's clearly not true. I don't know if you've ever seen that British comedy show Blackadder. Are you?
No, I don't think I have, but I'm sure people in our audience have.
Okay, so I'm sure a lot of people have the whole concept of the show. They have 4 different seasons of the show, and it's the essentially, well, the character Blackadder changes a little bit each time, but it's supposed to not be the same guy. It's supposed to be a descendant of him from before. So the first season happens, I think, in the 1500s, maybe earlier than that. No, it's got to be earlier. I don't know. Sometime way back in English history. And then the next season is a couple centuries later. The next one's a couple centuries later. And there's an episode when they're talking about the first dictionary that's ever been written. And now I can't remember who was the guy who wrote that first dictionary. I can't remember his name now. For some reason, it's slipping my mind, but he's a famous guy. He's a famous British guy. I'm sure if I were British, I would know it immediately, but this wasn't something that I was taught in school, so I'm not remembering right now. But anyway, in the show, there's, comedy stuff, and the guy says, this has every word in the English language, and then Blackadder just starts making up words. And he says, well, do you have this one or this one? He's just making them up. But the guy goes crazy, and he starts trying to write them in. And I think the point of that is that, of course, a dictionary is never going to have all the words in a language. It's always just going to be a selection of words in that language. And so the whole concept seems kind of odd to me. And how they decide that they're going to put certain words in and leave other words out, I have no idea.
Yeah, don't play Scrabble with that guy. He'll take you for a ride.
No, because if you open a dictionary, there are all sorts of words in there you've never heard in your entire life.
Right. Yeah, so, and there was an influx of interjections that they added to this most recent edition, too. And they said that the reason for that was because of their prominence in social media applications and to, again, mimic emojis and all of that. So they've added words like and oh and whelp and just things that seem utterly ridiculous to me.
Well, yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I have a feeling that the people who make dictionaries feel that they have to add a certain number of words each time.
There's a quota.
That if they don't do that, then people are going to get the idea that this is not a current dictionary. And also, you and I know very well, if you want to sell a new edition of something every year, you have to make a few small changes to it. You don't have to change a lot. But if you just make a few small changes, then you can get away with selling a new edition. And also, of course, I think there's marketing involved here as well. And the marketing works better if they include a certain number of unusual words. So there can be an article on this, and I mean, on TV or the radio, they'll have a story about, well, there are some new words in the dictionary this year, and they'll always focus on the ones that are the most off the wall. And that'll be a more interesting story for everybody else. So, I have a feeling that they just decide they're going to add a certain number of off-the-wall words. They're going to add a certain number of words that seem more normal but weren't in there. And then, that'll be a reason for people to buy the new edition of the dictionary, although, I don't know. I mean, does anybody buy dictionaries anymore?
I haven't bought one in about 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's the last time I remember using a dictionary was in college.
I mean, there's an app for that now. There's an app for everything.
Right. So, I mean, people use electronic dictionaries now rather than opening a book. But anyway, yeah, there's some strange words on here. Hophead is one of them, which is apparently somebody who's really into beer. And hangry.
Yeah,
so
that one just doesn't work for me.
I don't even understand that word. What's that supposed to mean? Hangry.
It's a portmanteau of hungry and angry.
Oh, so
the thought being, if you're really hungry, you turn into a ravenous monster.
So if you eat, you'll no longer be hangry?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So a bunch of ones here that I have heard, but often just seem more like kind of marketing words than anything. So they've got here avo and guac. Avo is, I guess, short for avocado, and guac is short for guacamole.
Yeah, because it was just too much to add on the extra 3 syllables.
Right. And I just, that doesn't seem like something, I don't think real people do that very much. That just seems like something that would be in a commercial.
I have heard guac quite a bit. That gets around.
Gosh, that's just, that's strange. I don't know. I mean, whatever.
I thought of another one too that was bothering me. Now people are saying rando instead of random because you just can't have the M on the end. So we have to get rid of it, I guess.
Yeah, that just doesn't seem like it's not that much shorter, really. In fact, if you say it, it takes just as long to say rando as it takes to say random. Yeah. In fact, rando might actually take a little bit longer to say.
That's true. Yeah.
So, I don't know. Kids these days. That's the whole thing. Kids these days.
Yeah. Well, before this devolves into a get off my lawn moment,
right.
Let's kind of bring this back around now. And so, purpose of today's show, in case anyone had forgotten, was...
I've totally forgotten.
was to point out some of the things in English that often go awry and go astray, and that they would not go awry or go astray if people only knew Latin. Of course, we're not telling you out there anything you don't already know, and I'm sure you were likely nodding your heads along with us and perhaps even vicariously venting along with us over the last 52 minutes or so. So we hope that you can sympathize with much of what we were saying, and I think you probably can. But this has been a fun discussion. It's been a nice departure from some of the things we normally talk about. And if you like what you've heard here today and you like what you've heard in the past, if you have heard us in the past, we would ask you to please subscribe to our podcast. Please check out our archives on the Gray Fox website, where we have all of the free downloadable materials for teachers at archives.grayfoxtutors.com, and that's gray with an E, so archives.greyfoxtutors.com. If you have any questions or comments, and there may be a few after this show, please email us those at podcast@grayfoxtutors.com. That's podcast@grayfoxtutors.com. And if you're watching or listening on YouTube, please click the subscribe button and then the bell so that you get a notification every time we have a new podcast episode up. And we also want to thank you for all the nice comments that have been left on the YouTube videos. We read them all and we really do appreciate them. So thank you so much for your loyalty and patronage. So Andrew, it's been a lot of fun talking about this with you today.
Absolutely. It's been fun as always for me as well.
Okay, and until next time, we will see you again for another episode of the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. Bye-bye.